Hi, my name is David Bell. I'm Professor of Economics at the University of Stirling. This short video is the second part of my Guide to Scotland's Public Finances. So, here are some more facts. In 2012-13, from the last video, we learned that Scotland had a deficit of £12 billion. That meant that the amount that it spent on public services exceeded the amount that it took in tax revenues by that amount, and that is equivalent to 8.3% of Scotland's GDP. The UK's deficit in 2012-13 wasn't much better than that in Scotland. It was 7.3% of GDP. The coalition government and the Labour Party agree that this kind of deficit is unsustainable. That is because the deficit contributes each year towards the national debt, and at this level of deficit, it's likely that the national debt will rise unsustainably, which will put a pressure particularly on future generations to repay that debt. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies, in its 2014 Green Budget, put it thus: disagreements between the major parties, such as they exist, focus on the timing and perhaps the composition of the fiscal tightening rather than on the eventual need for one. At the UK level, there is agreement that the UK has a significant fiscal problem. And just to illustrate this, these are the latest data for 2013, the fiscal deficit as a share of GDP for a number of European countries. Germany is leading the charge towards balancing its budget, in other words, having no fiscal deficit. And obviously that is the case. Then you go through a number of other countries, increasing size of fiscal deficit. Eventually you come to the UK with a 2013 deficit of around 5.8% of GDP. Then Spain and Ireland, which have had significant problems with their public finances in recent years, the only countries that have higher deficits than the UK. So what does the Scottish Government think about fiscal deficits? One way to look at this is to look at what the Fiscal Commission, which is what the body that the Scottish Government set up to advise it on its tax and spending policy, what that body thinks. Here are some quotes from the Fiscal Commission's most recent working paper. If debt is increasing as a share of GDP, this is undoubtedly unsustainable in the long run. That coincides with the current London view. The working group believes that there is clear merit in establishing rules which focus on the budget balance and net debt as a share of GDP. This suggests that the Scottish Government should be working towards some target in relation to the size of the deficit in relation to GDP and also the debt. In practice, this would take the form of two rules. Firstly, one to govern the short to medium term path for net borrowing. That's a complicated way of saying having a target for the deficit. And secondly, a rule to govern the medium to long term limit on net debt, i.e. the overall stock of debt. That's saying that overall the value of the debt that Scotland would owe shouldn't exceed a certain size in relation to Scotland's gross domestic product. So what does this mean? Well, for the UK as a whole, this diagram shows what would have happened had there been no policy action in terms of what is described there as public sector net borrowing, but it means the same as the fiscal deficit. What is expected to happen, given the policy changes that have been put in place as of December 2013, it also shows the outturns in the early part of the last decade, where public sector net borrowing was reasonably well contained. The clear lesson, though, from the figure is that had there not been policy action, then the deficit would have continued at around 10% of GDP, and that is an unsustainable level, as we've already discussed. Now, the declining line here is the effect of policy action. In other words, that's what's called the austerity program, and it does cause a lot of angst. We can see this from this graph. This shows how the coalition government has chosen to introduce, or to reduce the size of the fiscal deficit. It's a mixture of reducing current spending, debt interest that it would otherwise have had to pay, reducing welfare benefits, cutting back on investment, and increasing taxes. So this is for 2018-19 compared with 10-11. This is what the coalition government is expecting to have happened. In other words, there's been a big cut on other current spending, reduction in debt interest below what it would otherwise have been, cut in benefits. This includes things like the bedroom tax, a cut in investment spending by government, and tax increases. Most of the tax increases have already taken place, but there are still substantial cuts expected in other current spending, which is things like local government, education, and so on. Now, the Labour Party might have argued that the composition of this fiscal tightening should have been different, maybe more emphasis on tax increases. It might also have argued about the timing of the fiscal tightening. Tightening too quickly, too early, can cause the economy to grow more slowly. And there's a big debate about what was the appropriate rate of fiscal tightening, but there is no disagreement that fiscal tightening has to happen. So would an independent Scotland have to adopt a similar fiscal tightening approach? Well, firstly, it would have to go to the markets to borrow. Immediately independence happens. The markets would want to know that their money was safe. In other words, that there was a good chance that their loans would be repaid, and they would be at pains to ensure, therefore, that Scotland's debt was not on an unsustainable path. As a result, they would be seeking assurances that Scotland could contain its public spending. If there were a currency union with the rest of the UK, there would undoubtedly need to be a deal in relation to Scotland's fiscal policies. That is accepted by the Fiscal Commission. Currency unions don't work unless there's some form of fiscal arrangement which ensures that parts of the union can't destabilize other parts. There will also be pressure, undoubtedly, from the European Union, because all countries are expected to adhere to the Maastricht criteria, which hold that deficits should be no more than 3% of GDP on average, and debt should be no more than 60% of GDP on average. Scotland would start off with certainly a higher level of debt if it accepted its population share of the debt higher than 60% of GDP. So it's difficult to see how Scotland could escape the general pressure towards balancing its spending and its against the revenues that it can raise. So these are very, very important issues. I do get annoyed with people who say this is just some technical gibberish. Thinking, for example, about borrowing costs. The markets might, given that Scotland has no credit history, ask for higher rates of interest on the loans that it makes to Scotland compared with the UK, which has a long credit history. The consensus among economists is that Scotland will have to pay a higher rate than the UK, and some economists in London have argued that on average it might need to pay 1.1% more than the UK to borrow. The cost of that additional interest rate charge is equivalent to all of the current funding costs of Scotland's colleges and universities. These are important matters. I just leave you with that thought.